Eating together. Share, eat, learn, act. Sharing stories about food and society, explaining and inspiring actions to support and improve food systems.
Today we're hearing Phoebe Eisenbeis interview Kieran Morris about his urban agriculture organizing in the East Phillips neighborhood of Minneapolis. At the time of the interview, in the summer of 2024, Phoebe was working with Eating Together as part of a cohort of learners focused on equitable farmland tenure in the upper Midwest, right before she went back to school in environmental studies at the University of Montana.
Okay, so I'm here with Kieran Morris, and I'm Phoebe Eisenbeis. How are you? And if you can orient us to where we are right now, could be where you are emotionally or physically. We're in the Epic office.
For sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess to ground the scene spatially for everybody, we are in the East Phillips Improvement Coalition office, the EPIC office, and I honestly do not know when this place was founded, but it's like part of the entangled web of activism that's been going on for decades in this neighborhood, trying to, develop green spaces and like opportunities for gathering and development of green jobs and I don't know, all of the good stuff that we like across the neighborhood. We're also just a couple blocks over from the East Phillips Community Garden, which was started by EPIC, and I think it's run by their board. And my farm team from EPNI, which is East Phillips Neighborhood Institute, that's where we're doing our growing there, kind of in anticipation of moving into our big site, which I bet we'll talk about more. A lot of acronyms and stuff in there, but what you need to know is it's like a very kind of chill, homey office. I'd say it's got some like 70s organizing vibes.
Totally.
And we're at a big wooden table having a nice talk.
Yeah, sweet. Thank you for setting that scene. Yeah, I mean, I would love to just kind of get right into where EPNI's at right now. I know mid-July was kind of a time thrown around when things were hoping to be finalized with the site, and where is the project at right now? I've been part of occasionally planting things over at the community garden you just mentioned, and I know that's been one avenue to start growing food for community, just get our hands in the soil, but I know the site is still the ultimate goal, of course, so.
Yeah, well, I guess for folks who aren't familiar, I'll kind of lay out the broader context for all this. So the Roof Depot building is big. I think it's like 7 acres. It sits on Hiawatha, and it's been vacant for a number of years, I think almost 20 now. It was originally built as a warehouse for all of the roof supplies for the Sears company. So that's why the building itself is called the Roof Depot. And it kind of sat unused for a long time. So community members, especially folks who are still involved, kind of rallied around the idea of turning that building into a locus of good things for community, like it being an urban farm and aquaponics, hydroponics, kind of indoor and outdoor situation is like a big part of it, but also it's, a space for public art, for potentially recovery services, for eventually housing, bike shop, dance studio, indoor soccer field. So really just like a place, we call it a battery. So it's a place that generates good things for the neighborhood and then kind of ripples out on the larger pond of not only the Twin Cities, but like the bigger metaphysical web of organizing and food justice, environmental justice, land back, stuff like that. So that project was first conceived of 10 years ago, and there was a core group of people, many of whom, as I mentioned, are still involved in the project, who started organizing around it. But the city of Minneapolis, they wanted to purchase the building. The owner at the time said no. The city threatened eminent domain, and so they ended up just acquiring the property. They haven't done anything with it, but it was part of this 2024 plan. So they would demolish the building and build like a big public works yard, diesel fueling station for, I think, like 1,000 trucks or something like that.
And this is right in the heart of Minneapolis, just to set
Yes.
the scene for folks who maybe aren't as familiar. Very residential area.
And there's already a big public works yard there. But kind of the greater threat is that area of Minneapolis, they call it the arsenic triangle, because there was all this like industrial waste that was kind of paved over and like shoved into this specific area between the highways where there was once a railroad. And where the roof depot sits, there was once a pesticide factory to kill grasshoppers on the railroad. And so there's all this arsenic that's trapped underground. And so were the city to demolish the building, there's a lot of conjecture and debate around the science, but it's basically agreed upon by all parties that they would have been releasing that arsenic into the neighborhood and then following it up with all the fumes from 1,000 trucks. So at that point, and this was, the winter of 2022, it became kind of a much more like desperate fight to stop demolition, because it was going to happen in January or February. And that fight was led by folks at the Little Earth Housing Project, which is like one of the only Native American-led housing projects in the country. And we work with them a lot now too. They're a big part of the future of the project, but they really rallied the elders from Little Earth, the folks from American Indian movement who were connected with them. And there was a brief occupation of the site. It was beautiful. Folks were giving away water and tents and hand warmers and just all of these mutual aid supplies to unhoused folks in the neighborhood, to members of the community. There was a Sundance ceremony that took place to kind of usher things in. So it was like a weird brief vision of the future. And then the cops deployed a ton of riot police down there and cut their way in and broke it up. And there was a massive blizzard. It was a crazy night. And then the next day, folks were down at city council. And so through those efforts, the on-the-ground efforts, through a bunch of pro bono legal representation, and then through intervention on a state level, we were able to get like a purchase agreement going for the building and start to work towards purchasing it for the community to manifest that original vision. And I guess that kind of brings us to your question of where's the project at now and that mid-July closing date. So in the last legislative session, our funding that had been put together to buy the building was wrapped up in a omnibus bill of funding for numerous other infrastructural things across the state. And unfortunately, there was filibustering, there was debate, things were getting rushed ahead in that legislative session. And because the votes in the House were like 30 seconds over time, and legally they can't pass a bill that goes over the time of the legislative session. If like the voting takes too long, then it can't be passed. And so even though we had the votes, that bill did not go through. And so the easy pathway to the money that was kind of like laid out is no longer there. And the governor said there would not be an emergency session to try and like recount those votes. And so, yeah, because of like a stupid technicality, we were kind of screwed over in that way. But the good news is that there are other paths to fundraising. We're looking at loans and potentially taking a mortgage out on the building. There's also other donors and folks within the city and the county who are on our side and raising some money. So even though we're not as dead set on the mid-July date that we were at a few months ago, I think it's still looking really good for August.
Amazing. That's great to hear. And I feel like thank you so much for summing that up. Like this whole saga, really decades long saga, has been such a portrait of what it takes to get something going like this that is really born from community and desires and needs in community. And then that's just up against the bureaucracy and sometimes comes down to crazy little 30-second things that affect the whole future of this project. But it sounds like also there's so many other ways. Obviously, you're working tirelessly to still get this to work. There's no way it's not going to happen. I'm interested in what you see as having been helpful through this process so far, like as you've been connected, and who you see as, I mean, I think you've already touched on this a bit, but just for other efforts like this that I hope just continue to keep happening around the country and around the world, where maintaining and building essential structures of nourishment and care within community can be at the forefront and turning previously polluted or neglected spaces into something new. Yeah, I'm hoping that this is, I think it is part of a broader movement that has been going on for a while and hopefully continues to happen in this city and beyond. So I don't know, that's not a very straightforward question, but what is some advice maybe you would give for other projects or movements like this?
Well, I think it'll help too if I give a little bit of background on myself and how
yes,
I got
and I want to get into that
in the project.
Yeah.
You know, on a macro level, I went to school at the U of M for history and graduated right before COVID and George Floyd's murder. And so I went from studying this sort of like historical context with a focus on the Black diaspora and on autonomous structures essentially that people created to survive and to, move ahead. And when the uprising happened, it became very clear to me that, people have to generate people power. They have to generate like these alternate sources of basic items like, food and clothing and diapers and stuff, but also opportunities like education and empowerment and community organizing, because I think people have a lot more influence on the world than they give themselves credit for in this day and age. So I started out doing like food distribution stuff and then moved into urban farm organizing because, it's the kind of classic teach someone to fish thing. Like you give them a fish, they have a fish for a day. You teach them to fish, they have fish for a lifetime. It's like giving people food only accomplishes so much, but teaching them to grow food is like a golden ticket to the future. And so after the dust kind of settled, I really started to get involved in these different things. And when demolition was imminent for the depot, they kind of called upon, like, it reminded me of Lord of the Rings, the like Gondor calls for aid, like lighting the torches or whatever. They were like, people who have experience in activism, like come down to Little Earth and like talk, like how can we figure out how to stop this demolition? And so at the time, it was like the frontline protest skills that I had were what was being prioritized. But I remember thinking, whatever this thing evolves into, I want to be a part of it. I don't want to just like, fight the battle. I want to be a part of building something. And after demolition was stopped, I remember kind of asking like, so there's all this amazing stuff being planned for inside the building with like Will Allen and growing power and, all these different things with hydroponics, but what's going on with outside of the building? And that was kind of the gateway that led me to get involved in the work and start to make these plans for building raised beds and like getting the soil tested to see exactly what was safe to grow and then what things we could plant that would eventually heal the soil. And so I guess my advice, to bring it all back to your question, is find the area that you can kind of break into. An elder I really admire is Brother Jim Embry, who does a bunch of stuff down in Kentucky and works with seed saving around the country. And something he said to me one time is he was talking to Dick Gregory, I guess back in the 70s. And Dick was like, you're not going to start the revolution, you're not going to change the world, but you are going to move the needle a little bit more in that direction, and then the people after you are going to move it further. And I think that for me, it's just about finding those little places. Like, I get asked by college kids, how do you get involved in activism? And it's like, what do you love to do? You know, because if you can sew, then you can make a sign or a banner or shade covering for a garden. If you can paint or draw, then you can make a flyer, or you can, make a mural that will spread a message. So I think, like, for me, I've done a farming apprenticeship at the Arboretum. I grew up gardening with my grandmothers, so that was my natural way of breaking in. But I think everybody has one, and when we start to put those collective things together, that's like, my martial arts teacher, he talks about the village mindset, the idea of seeing the people around you as parts of a greater whole and being a part of that greater whole. And I think as activists, it's like, just find your little pebble to throw into the big pond, and those ripples together will make something happen.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and I feel like that's really connected to this quote I had pulled out that Stella Gardner and Ben Wallach did for, I think you had a conversation with them for the Minnesota Environmental Justice Heroes in Action, and they were talking about how, well, I'll just read this quote because I think it's really beautiful, but you, Kieran, went on to discuss how we as humans have dealt with crises before and will deal with them again, and emphasize that one cannot put the pressure on yourself to solve the issues of environmental justice, but we can fight for what we believe in while still enjoying life and the things that have been around forever. And I feel like this is really related to what the kind of pre-conversation you and I were having before we started recording, but just about like finding those pockets of joy and like how life is going to continue in this post or in the midst of like apocalyptic world, So I'm wondering, I think you've definitely already answered this too, but just wondering how you're finding hope and joy. I think this project is probably a huge source of that, I can imagine, and I've heard you talk about that before. But
joy and stress, yeah.
Yeah, if you can speak to any of that a little bit, if any of that's sparking you.
Well, absolutely. I definitely think about, whatever collapse, like, all the time. In my other job is Phoebe and I know each other because we were guides at Wilderness Inquiry together, doing canoeing and, teaching survival skills, fire building, shelter building, orienteering, all that stuff to kids, but also all kinds of different people from society, elders groups and community groups and families. And so, I think there's a lot of hope for me into tapping into those kind of basic skills that connect me to my ancestors, because they did experience, different apocalypses throughout time. It's like, if you're living in Europe during World War II, that's an apocalypse, you know what I mean? If you're an indigenous person living in the US and seeing, the radical transformation and like extraction of the environment, that is an apocalypse, like people have always been going through these things. I remember hearing about my great grandma in the Great Depression having to eat soup with plaster in it and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, when we connect to our roots in that way, and we connect to people, or the memories, the echoes of people who have been through those kinds of radical changes, it makes this day and age a little bit easier. I love archery, and I was able to get the experience of learning from Laughter Smith, who's an indigenous archer down in Oklahoma, in Anadarko. And he makes his bows in like the traditional way with Osage wood and working one piece of wood for like a really long time. And his, bowstrings come from deer sinew, and like he makes all his arrows out of dogwood and like scrap metal and stuff. And he's doing a thing where he's actually working at what was formerly like a boarding school, a conversion school, and he's turning it into a place where indigenous kids from across the nation can come and learn about their heritage and stuff, So going down there and seeing people who are using that sort of cultural heritage and history to uplift the youth, like that was super inspiring to me. And, you know, pretty much like no matter who you are, unless your ancestry comes from a very specific group of hunters, in which case maybe, you know, get more into hunting than gardening, I guess, but like your ancestors probably grew stuff, you know, and when you get your hands in the dirt, like you're connecting to them. Just like in the future, you know, I have no idea what that will look like, but our descendants will be like, you know, my great grandpa Kieran, like, you know, he planted stuff or whatever. He like fed the family, fed the community, so that I'm gonna do that, you know.
I love that. I love thinking about generations from now and generations behind us, and how we're just like the center of this, you know, big lineage and cycle at the time that we're alive, right? Well, we're actually here, and that our choices will be affecting other people. I mean, that's so basic, but it's kind of also revolutionary. Well, I'm kind of curious. I mean, this is circling back to the actual site, like the physical nature of the project you're doing, but what is the first thing you want to do when that fence is down and all of that? Like, I know you've had a lot of dreams and visions, and there's obviously so many people working on this project with so many visions, but I'm curious about within you, what's the first thing that you want to do?
Take a long, deep breath. But
love it.
No, I mean, the cool thing is right now we're building out our template for what it's going to look like. Like at the 17th Avenue Garden, my friend Forrest Hunt, who's Ojibwe and also in the master's program of plant science at the U, they've been leading these workshops in like traditional Ojibwe plant knowledge. So the first one was a Three Sisters planting with corn, beans, and squash, and those mounds are looking amazing. So the actual plant starts themselves were gathered from a bunch of different allied organizations, from Urban Roots in Saint Paul and from Agrarian Supply Company over on Hiawatha in Minneapolis. And then the soil and the compost that we used came from the Center School, which is an indigenous-led like educational project. They have their own garden. They're literally next door to where we're having this conversation. But people from the community got to get involved. They got to build the mounds with their own hands and plant the corn. And Forrest not only talked about kind of the scientific elements of like what, you know, chemicals and compounds are at play in the different plants, to also telling the traditional Ojibwe story of the Three Sisters. We were all just saying to each other, we're just going to do this at the site. You know, we're going to keep doing this. Monday, we've got a medicine wheel planting with tobacco and cedar and sage and sweetgrass. So we're going to build our infrastructure by involving the community and like educating them about the things that we do. So I think the number one first thing that we're going to do when the fence goes down is just like walk the land and really like in a material way think about where things are going to go. But to me, the big important thing after that is invite the community in. We've already done a lot of legwork of interviewing people door to door and at town hall meetings of what trees do you want to see here? What, you know, fruit do you want to grow here? What veggies do you want to grow here? I think we're going to journey together as a neighborhood, as an organization, as like a larger network, and manifest something in that way. In the same way that our Three Sisters planting, like we drew from many different sources, many different groups to do that experience and opportunity. Like we're just going to do that on a bigger scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you've had years of not practice, because it's all been for something too, but to get to the place of having this, you know, swath of land, you get to just create all of this scaled up.
Yeah.
That's great. So I want you to read a piece that you worked on, some farmer portraits, stewardship portraits, I guess, if you will, in the Ramsey County report, which maybe is too much to try to explain, but I'd love, you have strong writing kind of journalism background too. And so I'd love if you could share maybe a little bit about that, what it was like working on that project too, getting to know other local farmers and folks doing stuff. This is specifically in Ramsey County. And then if you wanted to just read an excerpt or any part of that.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely connected. Just so people in the internet ether don't get confused, Minneapolis, where we're doing the depot project, that's Hennepin County, and then Ramsey County, where this project that I'm going to read from, that's like where Saint Paul is, so it's a county over. I kind of cut my teeth as an organizer over there in Ramsey. I started working with Twin Cities Community Agricultural Land Trust. I'm still an organizer for them as well. And this excerpt that I'm going to read you, it comes from Urban Farm and Garden Alliance in the Rondo Frogtown neighborhood. My first ever urban farming event was the Rondo Open Streets that was being put on by UFGA, and Melvin Giles, who's an amazing individual, purple beard, purple hair, purple clothes, purple house. He's the purple man, and he loves his bubbles, but he's like a truly profound and inspiring figure. And I remember meeting Melvin and meeting Valentine, who I don't know if she's going to be on the podcast or has been, but yeah, so you might know her. And that was just like my first kind of exposure to urban farming and like the way that it could bring community together, because we were eating some food that was cooked from like the garden. And yeah, so this report that we did, basically it was kind of drawing together information about all of the different urban farmers that we could contact within Ramsey County with the actual like municipal codes and laws to see where are the holes, like where can policy help urban farmers and where is policy hindering urban farmers. So it was really fun to do that project and kind of revisit some of those different places that meant a lot to me. And Urban Farm and Garden Alliance was kind of in the forefront because that's like my origin point a little bit. And it's super fun to every year in the spring, I like to help with their seedling pickup from Youth Farm. So I get to check in with those folks still. And I hope to do a lot more stuff with them in the future as well. But yeah, this is a little piece I wrote. So the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance, or UFGA, is a collaboration of 8 to 10 community gardens and a group of backyard box gardeners that promotes reconciliation, healing, peace, social and environmental justice through the cultivation and sharing of food in the Summit University, Rondo, and Frogtown communities of Saint Paul. In 2015, they were named the Ramsey County Family Farm of the Year, and their continued efforts to hold space for the Black community legacy of Rondo and for community-led farm and garden technical assistance have been inspiring for everyone who has interacted with them. From the regular Rondo Reconciliation Lunch Group, facilitated by longtime urban farmer and Garden Alliance mentors Melvin Giles and Diane Dodge, to the ongoing farmer-to-farmer and community learning projects, often interwoven with community art. The Alliance has exemplified the relationship between everyday practices of growing food in the neighborhoods where people live and sharing cultural transmission that makes those neighborhoods thrive. Key examples of their contributions include the yearly Greens celebration, featuring greens preparations offered from across the allied farms and gardens, reviewed by local cultural celebrity judges, and also via a People's Choice Dot Survey Award in the context of a shared community meal. Regular workshops on everything from seed saving to dispute resolution, along with weekly children's garden programming in the Peace Sanctuary Garden. Action research projects to measure what urban farms and gardens yield, explicitly using the language of yield to encompass both the vegetative and also social effects of their efforts. These are explicitly framed in terms of peacemaking and reconciliation through gardening, and which draw on the Minnesota Legislative Report Card on Racial Equity Framework, as well as measuring various soil amendments being used to improve urban soils, such as the current cardboard mulch experiments. They have also sustained long-term work with the Ramsey County Master Gardener Program, which has become known as the Land Connectors Program, through their work reconsidering the implications of control and mastery narratives of land stewardship, especially in communities who have traumatic histories with both agriculture and mastery ideas in practice.
Beautiful.
And I feel like reflecting on that a little bit and going back to kind of what we were talking about of self-sufficiency and autonomous structures, that's part of why it was so cool to me to see UFGA working on so many different levels and working with kids on one end of the spectrum and elders on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and really beautiful to see how you did these portraits on these other local movements and organizations and alliances, and all of that I feel like is within you as you're doing now what you're doing, whether or not you use the language of mentor or whatever. But I find it really beautiful to see all these threads through you and how this movement is so lucky to have you and this project is so lucky to have you. That's really apparent. I'm wondering, just to wrap up, how can people who are interested get more involved? Coming to Friday meetings maybe, or we're sitting in your office hours right now that maybe just ended, but yeah, if you want to just, so as you say, the internet ether can know how to plug in if they are so inclined.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to plug in. I would say if you want to physically join me specifically, we do Friday meetings at 5 p.m. and that's at the East Phillips Community Garden. We also do these office hours regularly, usually Tuesdays or Thursdays, and we'll have folks have the opportunity to just come in and chat, chill, have a cup of tea. We also do workshops, usually 1 or 2 a month. So if you follow EP&I on any kind of social media, that's a really good way of getting updates. On a broader scale, even if you're not physically in the same space, there's a lot of really amazing things to plug into. I'm also part of the coordination team for Midwest Farmers of Color, and they do a social Zoom on Sundays where you can come and actually talk with other, especially like farmers of color across the Midwest. Also, the commons land stuff that Phoebe and Valentine are involved in, I think they do events that I've been to, and that's another really good opportunity to meet people and get involved directly. But beyond any sort of network connections, there's probably some sort of community garden or urban farm in your neighborhood. So just go for a walk and talk to someone if you see them growing. And if there's not, it's so easy to get started yourself. I think a lot of people have this idea that you need a green thumb and you have to be inclined or all the plants you try and grow will die. And it only takes little bits and pieces of knowledge. And there's so many good YouTube channels. There's lots of really good books. Market Gardener by Jean-Paul Fortier, that's what I read in my apprenticeship. And that really lays everything out from starting seeds to harvesting on a low budget in a really cool way. So just get out there and do something. It's super easy to get plugged in. And I think the cool thing is that a lot of people who are involved in gardening and especially in growing food, they're really inclined towards community. So they're also eager to share their knowledge with you too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Kieran.
My pleasure. Yeah, this is just the beginning.
Thank you for listening today. Eating Together is produced by the Food and Society Workshop. This story is part of our urban agriculture collection, assembled with the Twin Cities instance of the National Urban Agriculture Initiative of the United States Department of Agriculture. This collection has been produced in collaboration with the StoryMobile, a project of the Saint Paul Almanac, mentored by Melvin Giles. The Food and Society Workshop is convened by me, Valentine Cadieux. For details on this interview and others in the series, see foodfieldguides.com.